There are environments that seem stable, but they only stay that way because someone is holding everything together from the inside. Nothing stands out. Nothing seems wrong. Still, there is a cost that never shows on the surface. This video enters this discrete territory, where balance is maintained by force, without anyone admitting it, where the position you hold starts to matter more than who you are. This is not an open conflict. This refers to what happens when you're always expected to put up with it. A role that was never agreed upon, but it will now be charged. If you've ever felt like you needed to always be whole so that the others wouldn't collapse, this will make sense. Like the video and follow, this type of reading isn't comfortable, but it's necessary. You don't come out of these interactions clearly hurt, confused, tired without having made any effort. It felt like something had shifted inside, but I couldn't pinpoint what. There was no shouting, there was no direct attack. Nothing that justified the weight that remained afterward. Still, the body knows. The silence that follows the encounter is not rest, it's drainage. There are conversations that end and continue happening inside you, phrases that keep coming back, gazes that repeat themselves. A strange need to explain oneself, even when no one asked for any explanation. At some point, you start to revise what you said. Then, what did he think? Then, who are you? This doesn't start with violence. It starts out as something seemingly normal, a plea for help, a recurring complaint. A person who is always confused, always in crisis, always needing someone to listen patiently. And you listen, because he knows how to listen, because he learned how to support himself, because he thinks that's maturity. There is a recurring idea in Carl Jung presented as a clinical reading, not as consolation. That which one refuses to recognize in oneself seeks expression outside, in another person, in another body, in another consciousness. But it doesn't appear under that name in everyday life. It appears as a diffuse weight, like guilt without a crime, taking responsibility for something that was never yours. At first, you call this empathy, then emotional turmoil. Later, he starts calling it his own problem, and that's exactly where something has already been reversed. You don't realize the moment when the conversation stops being an exchange and turns into a flush. There is no warning. There is no visible break, just a weariness that accumulates. The body begins to react before the mind. The desire to avoid, the anticipated discomfort, the feeling that something will be required again. Even so, you're going. Because you don't know how to say no without feeling cruel. Because he learned that endurance is a virtue. And perhaps that's why no one has ever attacked you openly. It wasn't necessary. You stayed there. You start to notice it later, never during. During the process, everything seems manageable. You listen, you agree, you consider, you accept. I left the conversation with a vague feeling of having been helpful. The problem arises when the body takes its toll. My chest feels heavy for no clear reason. His head keeps spinning over details that aren't his own. A vague sense of guilt sets in, as if you've failed at something that no one has been able to explain. It's a noiseless drainage system. You try to rationalize. Tell yourself you're exaggerating. Perhaps he's being too sensitive, that the other person was just going through a difficult time. But the pattern repeats itself. Every time you step away, something inside you needs hours or days to get back on track, as if he had left parts of himself scattered throughout that interaction. You begin to doubt your own perception. He doesn't remember exactly what was said, but he remembers the effect. And the effect is never mild. A strange need arises to justify oneself mentally. To review speeches, it makes you wonder if it was too harsh, or cold, or unfair, even when there was no conflict at all. This is one of the most subtle signs of this type of relationship. You leave feeling responsible for discomfort you didn't create, carrying a weight she doesn't know how to name. At some point, you take on the role of emotional stabilizer. Not because someone asked, but the environment seems to collapse if you don't support it, and providing for it becomes a habit. You learn to ignore the physical signal, the tension in my stomach, tiredness that doesn't go away with rest, irritation that appears without a defined target, call that maturity, out of empathy, to be someone who can endure. But there's a huge difference between listening and absorbing, between being present and becoming a receptacle. When you start coming out of these interactions feeling weaker than when you went in, something is already wrong. Even though no one raised their voice, even if everything has been polite, even if, from the outside, it looks normal. This is how the drainage system is installed. No visible violence, no clear villains. Just by repeating a visit to a place where you always leave in debt. And the more you try to be right, the more entrenched that place becomes. Because nobody questions who can endure it. There is a mechanism that operates beneath the conversation. He doesn't announce himself. He doesn't ask for permission. It just happens. When someone can't stand certain parts of themselves, those parts don't disappear. They are looking for a place where they can exist without responsibility. That's where projection comes in. What a person doesn't recognize as anger becomes a subtle accusation. What she doesn't acknowledge as a weakness becomes criticism disguised as concern. What she cannot bear as guilt needs to be placed on someone who can handle it. And you can handle it. Not because he is weak, but because it has interior space. Because she knows how to listen without interrupting. Because it doesn't react immediately. In Jungian terminology, the shadow is everything that the subject does not integrate into their own consciousness. But in everyday life, this doesn't appear as theory. It appears as a displacement. Tension that isn't yours begins to reside within you. The confusion that wasn't born within you begins to inhabit you. And the more you try to understand, the more space you give the other person to find relief. Some people manage their emotions by letting it all out. They speak and feel better. You listen and end up worse off. That's the blind spot. Because while the other person finds relief, you find noise. While he feels understood, you feel drained. While he leaves feeling lighter, you're left carrying something you didn't ask for. The projection is not a conscious attack. It is rarely outright malice. It's a mechanism for psychic survival. And every survival mechanism exacts a price from someone. At first, you believe you are helping. Then, he begins to realize that he is being used as a discharge surface. But he can't find the words for it. Because no one offended you. No one was aggressive. Nothing happened clearly. Just the effect. You start to wonder if you're becoming too sensitive. If you're interpreting it incorrectly. If the problem is your difficulty dealing with difficult people. That's the trick to successful projection. She makes you doubt yourself while the other person regulates themselves at your expense. And the more you try to be fair, balanced, and empathetic, the more functional you become in this invisible arrangement. The shadow of the other finds shelter, and you pay the rent with your own stability. Without realizing it, she accepted that position. At some point, this stops being just something that happens. It turns into a piece of paper, not written, not agreed upon, but expected. You become the person who understands, that which calms, that puts things into perspective, that translates the chaos of the other into something bearable. When there's tension, they look to you. When there is conflict, they expect you to mediate. When someone explodes, they rely on their ability to absorb the impact. And you assume the responsibility, not out of vanity, but because he feels responsible for the climate. Because he realizes that if he does nothing, everything will get worse. This is the moment when empathy ceases to be a choice and becomes a function. You start adjusting the tone, measuring words carefully, silencing legitimate impulses so as not to destabilize, swallowing natural reactions to maintain the balance of the environment. Little by little, something shifts. You no longer fully engage with interactions. Come prepared to contain, to filter, to hold on to whatever comes next. This constant preparation comes at a cost, but nobody recognizes it as effort, because it seems natural for you. Being understanding becomes an obligation. Being strong becomes an expectation. Being balanced becomes an implicit contract. And every time you try to leave this place, something strange happens. People seem confused, offended, or disappointed. Not because you were aggressive, but because he stopped fulfilling a role that was already considered his responsibility. That's where the quietest reversal occurs. You come to be seen as cold when you protect yourself. Selfish when setting limits. It's unfair when you withdraw. The virtue that put you in this position is now being used against you. You realize you can't fail. That which cannot tire, that you can't specify. Because the role they gave you doesn't allow for humanity, pure utility. And the most dangerous thing is not what others do. It's the moment when you start to see yourself through that role. When you start to feel guilty for not being able to provide for them. When you start measuring your worth by your ability to endure. That's when drainage ceases to be occasional, and it becomes an identity, without anyone explicitly asking for it. When you try to step outside the box, the environment reacts, not explicitly, but with enough signs to pull you back. The tone changes, people become drier, or more needy, or strangely offended. You perceive a diffuse discomfort in the air, as if something were out of place. And that's it. You've stopped functioning like you used to. Perhaps it has become quieter, perhaps I responded less. Perhaps he said he couldn't that day. Nothing aggressive, nothing dramatic. Even so, the reaction is coming. Someone commented that you've been distant. Another suggests that you've changed. Some people suggest that you're cold, or egocentric, or difficult. It's subtle, but it's enough to trigger the guilt you know so well. You start to wonder if you overdid it. You could have explained it better, if it wasn't too harsh. The environment does this because it was organized around its function. When you move, the structure creaks. Those who used to unload lose their place of relief. Those who depended on its stability lose their support. And that generates irritation. Not against the mechanism, but against you. This is the point where many people back down. Not because they believe they were wrong, but because the external discomfort outweighs the internal cost. You feel the pressure to return to the familiar place, to soften, to compensate, to fix the climate. And he often does it without realizing it. It resumes a cautious tone. Reopen the space. Absorb again. The atmosphere calms down, people relax, and you're back to carrying the weight. This is the invisible game. There are no clear villains, just a system that self-regulates at its own expense. Every time you threaten to step out of the picture, the industry tries to put you back in. Guilty, with surprise, with veiled accusations. And if you don't understand the mechanism, you end up believing that the problem is your attempt to change. It is not. It is the system reacting to the loss of a discharge point, and the question begins to take shape, even if you haven't fully formulated it yet. How long are you going to keep this up? There comes a point where the reading needs to be cut off. Don't go into detail, I can't explain it any better. Cut. Carl Jung said, in a direct clinical reading, that what is not made conscious returns as destiny, not as a metaphor, as a structure. When someone doesn't face their own shadow, it doesn't disappear. She moves, looking for an available body, an open psyche. Someone who doesn't return it immediately, and you don't give it back. You absorb, organize, translate, and sustain. While the other feels lighter, more certain, more justified. This is where the reversal is complete. You start carrying burdens that aren't yours, doubts that didn't originate in you, conflicts that he never created. And the more you try to be fair, the more it serves to create imbalance in others. There is a phrase that doesn't comfort, but it organizes the necessary internal cutting. You are not being attacked. You are being used as a psychic surface, used as an emotional regulator, used as a repository for what the other cannot bear to see in themselves. There is no explicit hatred. There is no direct aggression. That's why it's so difficult to understand. But the effect is always the same. You come out smaller, more confusing, heavier, and you start to doubt who you are, from his memory, regarding your intention, because of his character. This is the silent cost of accepted projection. Not because you consciously allowed it, but that's because he was trained to confuse empathy with unrestricted availability. From this point on, something changes. It wasn't within. The question is no longer whether you can endure it. You always succeeded. The question is different, and she doesn't ask for an immediate answer. How much of yourself have you lost trying to hold on to what was never yours? Continuing like this comes at a cost that almost never appears all at once. It accumulates. You start to lose your internal bearings. He no longer trusts his own discomfort so much. When something weighs heavily on you, The first reaction isn't to protect yourself, it's to question yourself. Am I exaggerating? Was I being unfair? Perhaps I didn't understand correctly. This movement is slow, but corrosive. Gradually, her intuition ceases to be a guiding principle and turns into suspicion. Their discomfort then requires external authorization to exist, and he almost never receives it. You start explaining yourself, even before being asked, to justify simple limits. I apologize for needing the space. And this doesn't only happen in these relationships, spread it. At work, you take on responsibilities that aren't yours. Within the family, there are tensions that no one names. In friendships, it becomes the permanent point of equilibrium. The cost isn't just exhaustion, it's a loss of focus. You start organizing yourself around the other person, based on the other person's mood, regarding the instability of the other. Without realizing it, their identity comes to include the role of provider. And when that happens, something fundamental is lost. You no longer know who you are when you're not being useful. You no longer know where the other ends and you begin. He no longer knows if silence is rest or emptiness. That's the price of remaining available for what isn't yours. There is no immediate collapse. There is erosion. You'll adapt to the weight, normalizing wear and tear, lowering internal expectations to fit the role they created for you. Until one day he realizes he's living below his potential, less alive, less whole. And it can't point to a clear culprit, because nobody did anything wrong. This is the most dangerous point. When there is no external villain, you become the internal defendant. And it continues. Because leaving seems riskier than staying, but the question no longer goes away. The more you endure, the less of you is left. There is a silent agreement underpinning all of this. It was never said out loud, but it was repeated often enough to become the rule. You stay, you listen, you can handle it. In return, the environment remains stable. Crises don't just explode. Conflicts are not acknowledged. People don't need to look at themselves. This is the invisible contract. No one explicitly asked you to carry it, but everyone came to expect it, and you, at some point, accepted it. Not through submission, but for identity's sake, to be balanced, the mature one. What both sides understand, the one who doesn't lose their head. These virtues were praised, reinforced, transformed into value. And that's how the trap closes. Because every time you try to move beyond the planning stage, you lose not only functionality, losing recognition, loss of belonging. You lose the image of who you are. Fear is not just about conflict. It comes from the emptiness that arises when you are no longer needed. Who are you when you're not mediating, when it's not providing support, when it's not absorbing? This is the point that is rarely addressed, because it hurts more than just being tired. Maintaining the contract costs energy. Breaking the contract costs you your identity. And the environment knows it, even without consciously knowing it. That's why when you change, something breaks. It wasn't. Among the people who depended on their place, they feel the loss of a function, and they try to restore it. Sometimes with a charge, sometimes with victimhood, sometimes with punitive silence. Nothing explicit, everything is effective. You realize that simply leaving isn't enough. It is necessary to sustain the loss of the role. And that's perhaps the hardest part. Because nobody applauds you for that, nobody validates it. You cease to be useful before you become whole. And that creates a void that is frightening. But it is in this void that something begins to reorganize itself. Not as a relief, as a displacement. You no longer fit where you used to. And he still doesn't know where it will fit. This break is not comfortable, but it's real. And the choice begins to assert itself, even without being explicitly stated, to continue being functional in creating imbalance in others, or to go through the loss of an identity that was never truly theirs. Leaving this place doesn't come with a feeling of victory. It comes with loss. You lose the predictability of relationships. You lose the other person's quick response. He loses the position where he already knew how to act. When you don't absorb it, the other person has to deal with their own excess. And it doesn't always succeed. Some drift away. Others get annoyed. Some people try to pull you back with reminders of how you always were different. You realize you're not called upon to do everything anymore. It is no longer consulted. It's no longer necessary in the same way. And that hurts. Not because you want to be used, but because part of their identity was there. There is a silent grief in this displacement. The grief of ceasing to be the point of equilibrium, to cease being a safe haven for others' instability. At the same time, something strange happens. The body begins to become lighter. Silence ceases to be a burden. Intuition reappears, still timid, but present. It's not freedom, it's uncharted territory. You start to realize who was relating to you and who was relating to the role. And that distinction changes everything. This is where many people back down, because temporary loneliness seems more threatening than familiar weariness. But moving forward requires enduring this loss without lengthy explanations. No speeches. Without constantly trying to justify themselves. If you recognize this type of dynamic, it makes sense to stay here. Not because of a promise, but that's because this type of reading is usually neither comfortable nor quick. Those who go through this displacement don't become lighter immediately. You become more responsible for yourself. And that changes the game. The environment is still testing the waters. It still provokes. He is still trying to reinstall the old paper. But something doesn't fit anymore. You feel that going back would cost more than staying in this strange interval. And for the first time, he is beginning to accept this cost. Not as a solution, as a position. What you're losing right now isn't support. It's a role that was never yours. What breaks down here is not just a relational dynamic, it's an image of oneself. For a long time, you existed as the answer, as a containment measure, like fine-tuning the chaos of others. When that fades, what remains is a silence that is not empty. It is a lack of function. You realize that much of what you called a bond was sustained by your constant availability. The proximity decreased when you weren't regulating it. That intimacy depended on how much you erased yourself. This doesn't come as a clear revelation. It comes as small realizations that hurt more than a direct confrontation. Invitations that never arrive. Conversations that don't go deep. People who become less interested when you're no longer absorbing their thoughts. It is at this point that the temptation to return arises. To be a little more flexible. A little more understanding. Just so as not to lose the connection. But you already know the price of that. You can feel in your body what it costs to stay. Constant tension, emotional vigilance, the struggle to maintain a balance that was never truly his. And something changed, even if it still hurts. You start to support a narrower space, not in the sense of impoverished, but more specifically defined. Not everything gets in. Not everyone stays. Not every demand finds a solution. This provokes reactions. Some explicit, other passive-aggressive behaviors, others are silent. But you realize you don't have to answer them all. This is the most difficult part of the journey. Stop explaining. Stop justifying simple limits. Stop trying to be understood by those who only accepted you while you were functioning. There is no sense of victory here. There is a strange sobriety. It's as if you were learning to be yourself without applause. It is at this point that the conflict ceases to be with others, and it becomes the old image you had of yourself. The one who confused value with utility, presence with absorption, love that wears you down. This image is starting to crumble, and there is no ready-made replacement. You still don't know who you are without the role. But he knows he can't continue being like that, and this awareness does not bring peace, it brings responsibility. Responsibility for not returning to the place that consumed you, just to avoid the discomfort of the present. The journey doesn't end here. But something essential has already been lost, and you can't pretend you didn't notice. There comes a point where the question is no longer about relationships, it's about existence. Who do you become when you stop being a storage unit? Who are you when you're not absorbing, mediating, compensating? This point offers no answers. He demands a stance. There is a cost to not returning. And you begin to feel it clearly. Some relationships wither. Others reveal that they were never symmetrical. And certain people only existed in your life as long as you were available to carry what they didn't want to look at. There is no redemption in this. There is loss. But there is also something that returns slowly, a sense of axis, a clearer perception of what is yours and what never was. You start to notice that silence doesn't hurt in the same way. Temporary solitude is less corrosive than a draining presence. Saying no, even with guilt, preserves something that saying yes would slowly destroy. This action doesn't make you any kinder, no longer understood, no longer surprised. It makes you less easily manipulated, and this comes at a social cost. Some people accuse you of having changed. Some say you've become cold. Some people try to rekindle guilt with memories from the past. But you already recognize the mechanism, and she can no longer pretend not to see. In her book, The Forgotten Agreement, Luciana Santos calls this the breaking of the implicit pact, the moment when you stop living according to expectations that were never explicitly stated, but were always demanded, not as romantic liberation, like a crossing. You realize you're not becoming a better person, you are becoming less available to be used. And that changes everything. What once seemed like empathy is beginning to reveal signs of self-neglect. What seemed like maturity reveals its hidden cost. What seemed like love reveals silent agreements. None of this gets resolved, it is supported. And the question that remains is not an uncomfortable one. She is not conciliatory, it doesn't close. She simply exposes the point of no return. Who you need to stop being. To stop serving as a shadow for those who refuse to face their own. If you'd like, tell us in the comments where you still feel like you're carrying something that isn't yours.